in the chat. Awesome, thanks. Please do take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat. We want this to feel like a community, so please feel free to share your name and where you're calling in from. And with that, let's kick off our panel. So our first panelist is Hakima Abbas, the co-founder of the Black Feminist Fund. Her full bio will be shared in the chat. And Hakima, my question to you is, how can we confront aid as an imperial instrument and center reparations, accountability, and community-rooted futures instead?
Thank you so much, Lola. So I'm coming from, I think, a moment where what I would love to do is really contextualize what aid is and what it isn't for us. And then I believe Arby is going to talk also about alternatives and what's possible. So let me start. You mentioned, Lola, we're in this moment where a lot of people are talking about aid cuts and the impact of those. And so I'll frame my remarks largely also around my continent, the continent of Africa. According to HRFN, Overseas Development Assistance, so ODA, is projected to decrease by 62 billion in 2026. And that's global. I'll pop the link in the chat for that report. 84% of these decreases are coming from cuts from just 3 countries, the US, Germany, and the UK. And a significant impact of aid cuts, which have real life and immediate implications, are on health programs. Based on USAID decreases alone to Africa, there are projections of up to 92% decrease of reproductive health programs and 89% of maternal and child health programs. It's important to note, though, that while ODA has decreased from these countries, military spending has increased. I want to emphasize that because it's not that there isn't money in the world. Rather, it's that we live in a world that prioritizes warfare over healthcare. And putting aid in perspective in terms of also what capital inflows look like for, again, if you take Africa as an example, in 2023, ODA totaled 73 billion, thereabouts. But when you look at other capital inflow, like remittances, those were 90 billion. So 20 billion more in remittances than in aid. 97 billion in foreign direct investment and 479 billion in tax revenue went to Africa. But we also see the capital outflows, which make Africa actually a net creditor to the world economy. So according to figures from the African Development Bank in 2022, the continent lost more than 587 billion each year to capital flight, which includes the fact that we pay extra on premiums on the cost of borrowing. That includes illicit financial flows and corruption. But more than anything else, Africa loses 275 billion from multinational corporations that transfer profits out of Africa through irregular means. So I'm saying that because aid is just a small piece of the puzzle. But I also want us to understand that aid is about power. And to do that, if we go back to the origins of aid, so it's said that the Marshall Plan in 1948, where the US, after World War II, provided foreign aid to Western Europe, that's credited as the beginning of modern aid. The US then transferred 13 billion in economic recovery programs, which in today's numbers would be about equivalent to 137 billion. But while the Marshall Plan's intention was to rebuild economies, it wasn't altruistic. It was also to remove trade barriers with Europe, create security pacts and alliances, and prevent the influence of the USSR. What's often not written about, interestingly, is that 2 years before the Marshall Plan, there was the Molotov Plan, which was a USSR plan to provide aid to Eastern European countries. And that also led to joint companies being created, as well as national economic plans being created that were supported by the USSR. So we see that aid, even from its origin, is a tool of power over others' economies. And aid, even humanitarian aid, that is reliant on the power of the few, as you were saying in your intro, Lola, has failed people. And it's failed people in the DRC, it's failed people in Sudan, it's failed people in Palestine. What aid has meant for the global South in its present form is twofold: a debt crisis and economic dependency. In 2024, Africa was estimated to have paid 163 billion just to service debts. Aid is part of an architecture in which countries have become peripheral capitalist markets structured to maintain the supply of resources to hegemonic nations, while destroying indigenous solutions to meet our own people's needs. And to be clear, that international financial architecture is structured with intention to maintain Africa in economic chokehold. Because if the balance of power were to tip to those who have human and natural resources, the whole world order would shift. And what I think we need more than ever right now is for the whole world order to shift. I just want to also take a moment to a bit of a warning that the next frontier of debt seems to be climate. While the eco side is fueled by capitalist consumption, the solutions being driven by the global north and by corporations maintain the economic dependency and subordination of the rest. We saw that last week at the COP. There's been massive financialization of nature, and that includes through aid. So again, just as an example, South Africa, which is hosting the G20 this weekend, launched its Just Energy Transition Partnership in 2020. To date, only 4% of the financing is in the form of grants, so 96% in the form of loans. And of that 4%, 76% of the grant funds have been given to foreign entities, so entities outside of South Africa. Sometimes people ask me, given my role at the Black Feminist Fund, if philanthropy is going to step in. And I think the question is, do we want it to? Much of the wealth created in order for philanthropy in the form that it takes today has been accumulated from the exploitation still of Black and other oppressed people's labors, bodies, lands. And of course, too much of philanthropy reinforces the asymmetry of power between those who have and those that don't. And not all, in fact, not most of philanthropy goes to progressive causes. So trillions of dollars of philanthropy are channeled every year to causes that are against bodily autonomy, reproductive rights, just economies, dignified labor, even ecological care and stewardship. So I'm not saying, I think in this moment, philanthropy can be a stopgap, and we certainly need one to move from the collapse caused by the sudden withdrawal of aid. But what we need more so is economic sovereignty. And the extractive, imperialist, capitalist economic system is killing the earth and the majority of people while benefiting a tiny few, as we know. There's a report that was commissioned and just released by South Africa for the G20 this weekend about inequalities. In there, they said that in the last 4 years, the richest 1% have captured 41% of all new wealth, while the poorest of half of humanity only benefited from 1% of all new wealth. So economic sovereignty is our ability to determine our economic policies and resources, to make our own decisions on trade, fiscal policy, and industries without coercion, without the threat of war, sanctions, assassination, to be able to meet national needs without interference. And I think we're living in a context where power is shifting. People all over the world are rising up against continued economic strangulation, from Indonesia to Kenya to Argentina. And we really need to overhaul this economic and financial system, not to reform it. We need to overhaul it and for our economies to serve the people. I feel we're running out of time. I'll end there, Lou.
Thank you so much, Hakima. Saw reactions in the chat and with the emojis. A lot of really surprising statistics, I think, for people to hear. A lot of new information. So thank you so much for that framing. I'm going to put a prompt in the chat. Please do use the reply function if you want to share your thoughts, something you learned from Hakima's remarks or something that surprised you. So we'll move to our next speaker. Our next panelist is Arbi Bagu. He's the director of Aid Reimagined and a researcher at ODI Global. His full bio will be shared in the chat as well. So Arbi, my first question to you is, how do we acknowledge the complex role of aid as a construction of colonial imagination and soft power domination, while also acknowledging the very real and immediate need that the aid industry meets for many at the periphery? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Lola, and thank you so much, Hakima, for that brilliant kind of like setting up of the context. And it's great that I was supposed to initially come on and then Hakima next, but then this was perfect. I would say that actually I agree with a lot of what Hakima said, and I accept that aid, as we know it, arose in a specific historical trajectory, right? One where the global north has dominated through slavery, colonization, and extraction, the racialized people of the global south. And this can be seen in our current institutions. As Hakima said, the Marshall Plan, but you can even trace this all the way back to Henry Dunant, who is the founder of Red Cross. He was actually a supporter of colonial projects in North Africa. But I think what I'm about to say is a provocation, right? I think there's a lot of people who say we should reject aid fundamentally. It is fundamentally and inherently racist and colonial. I'm not sure if I kind of like 100% completely agree with this position. I accept that it has that kind of like history, but if we collectively give up on aid, it seems defeatist, right? And I'm going to give you two reasons. And I think it's also worth mentioning that I've argued in the past that while aid as we know it is problematic, altruism is an innately human condition. We are social beings, and we've seen through evidence in anthropology and even in economics and behavioral sciences that we, as social beings, we want to help people. And so to give up on this idea of helping each other in international cooperation is problematic for two reasons. Firstly, when people say they don't believe in aid and they completely reject it, when you ask them what's next, a lot of people say, I don't know. But aid sector reforms have been going on for a really long time. Some would even say as early as 1980s, but it came to a head nearly half a decade ago, since the Black Lives Matter protest during the COVID years. And a lot of effort have been put into thinking about creating a more equitable and just aid system since then. We can't know everything, sure, but we already know some things, right? And so to say that, what's next, and some people would say, I don't know, is a little defeatist and maybe even irresponsible. I think there is a tendency for a lot of like progressive movements to get caught up in kind of like fanciful theorizing and say that, we need to wait until we change the entire world. But it's never going to happen overnight. And we can take small steps towards this, right? Um, and second of all, and I think this is the really important thing, is that if we reject aid and if we reject the concept of aid and we have nothing to replace it with, we risk losing to the far right, who are isolationist and anti-international cooperation. And actually, this is not a risk. This is already a reality. We see far-right political movements build political power, win elections, and dismantle the architecture of international cooperation, such as USAID and the UN. These are not perfect institutions, but I argue that they were a net positive. They were doing harm, of course, in many communities, but there were also pockets of uh, uh, positive and good examples within these institutions. Um, And if we risk losing, and if we lose to the far right, the replacement is a lot worse. And so I think this is really what confronts us if we are not able to propose concrete alternatives to aid as we know it.
Great, thanks, Arby. A quick follow-up question, though. How can we create alternatives to the current system of aid as we know it?
So I think what I'm proposing is we move from aid as we know it to aid as we fight for. And how can we make this a possibility? I will share 3 examples from the macro level to the meso level to the micro level. And the common themes of these examples is that instead of waiting for the global north and the international system to shift power, these examples are ones that take power. And so aid as we know it can become aid as we fight for if we can make it in such a way that it supports not just shifting the power, but also supports taking power by grassroots actors in the global south. And when I propose these alternatives, I'm standing on the shoulder of giants, of generations of people who have already thought about these things. And so I'm building on some of their ideas. So the first one, at the macro level, is an idea that I would call decolonizing industrialization. And I build on the academic research of the scholar named Horman Chitonge, who says that he says industrialization is an act of decolonization because economic relations between the global south and the global north remain unequal. And as Hakima said earlier, the global north is enjoying preferential trade deals while the global south remain in debt. Workers in the global south are incorporated in value chains that exploit workers or those, especially those who are part of marginalized groups such as indigenous people, people in lower caste, and women and others. And I think this is something that we don't talk about enough in kind of like progressive development and humanitarian circles. We should not give up on the idea of industrialization and economic progress in the global south. I think Hakima mentioned earlier that the goal should be economic sovereignty, and this is what will deliver economic sovereignty to societies in the global south. But the caveat is that we have to reimagine how industrialization looks like, not as endless growth to the detriment of our planet or something that is obsessed with GDP. So how can we decolonize our imaginaries when it comes to, for example, new industries and new technology, including AI, building industries and businesses that reflect our society's values and is inclusive of everyone? We can't give up on this ambition because if we do, our countries will remain subjugated by the economic interest of the global north. The second example, at the meso level, is political movements as humanitarian actors. I'll give you an example from the Philippines. In 2022, we've had our presidential elections, and there were 2 main candidates. The first one is the son of our former dictator, Bongbong Marcos, and the second one was Leni Robredo, who was the progressive candidate. She was like our Zoran Mamdani. She represented change and hope, and a lot of people, especially young people, mobilized in support of her, unlike anything we've seen in recent Philippine politics. Sadly, she lost. But what she did was she founded a nonprofit organization called Angat Buhay. And one thing that Angat Buhay has done is to convert the team of volunteers that formed around her campaign during the elections and converted them into community-based volunteer groups that respond during disasters. So now there are over 200 of these groups all over the country. Angat Buhay trains them and provides accreditation to them, and these groups can use the Angat Buhay branding, which lends them credibility. But they are their own entities, so they can apply for funding directly, and Angat Buhay also provides funding to them. Now, during disasters, Angat Buhay groups have become one of the first groups to respond. And we have seen this, and I've seen this firsthand in the most recent typhoons in the Philippines. But crucially, what this does is that it preserves the political movement that rallied behind a progressive candidate, and it preserves that mobilization so that, let's say, during the next election, when new candidates come up and when there is a need to support progressive candidates, you do not need to build from scratch. And historically, this is a winning strategy. In fact, we've seen this, for example, in the Zapatista movements, where their main thing is public service provision to communities. And that's how they politically organize. So at the meso level, this is an alternative that we can think about. And at the micro level, the third example, I'm drawing from my own PhD research around refugee economies. So my research looks at how markets emerge in refugee camps. In many refugee camps, refugees are not allowed to take up jobs, employment, or own properties. But in many refugee camps, there emerge these kind of like underground informal markets where people break the rules, subvert the rules, and they engage in trading and production and exchange. And through these breaking of the rules, an economy emerges. Um, and so, you know, these economies have gotten so big in some of the refugee camps that even the governments are now interested in them because they see that there is a lot of money in these refugee camps. We often think about markets in terms of its link to capitalism, but something that I am arguing in my dissertation is that markets are us. We are the markets. The people are the markets. We don't have to always go by the capitalist rules. We can create our own institutions and our own rules that reflect our values as societies. A lot of humanitarian assistance in refugee situations are very top-down, creating special economic zones or forcibly formalizing businesses that refugees don't want to engage with. But the lesson here is if we look at what's happening at the grassroots, at the bottom up, if we look at what people are already doing by looking at the rules that they are breaking, then we can rethink the way that we engage with the efforts of people. And so just to end, I think, we need to reclaim aid. We shouldn't give up on it because altruism is a social condition that is innate in being humans. And the way to change aid is from changing aid as we know it to aid as we fight for. And to be able to do that, we have to think of radical alternatives that doesn't just shift the power, but support the taking of power of marginalized people, especially in the global South. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Arby. I see a question in the chat. We will save it for the discussion later. I'm going to put another prompt in the chat. Feel free to already share your thoughts on what Arby shared. And we will move to our next speaker, which is Japreet Kaur, who is the Executive Head of Philanthropy and Public Engagement at All We Can. Her full bio will also be shared in the chat. And Japreet, my question for you is how do we dismantle colonial legacies and soft power dynamics embedded in philanthropic practice and narratives around aid?
Thanks, Lola. Really great to be here with everyone. Sorry for any background noise. But yeah, that's a really good question. I think I just want to start off by saying that, you can study philanthropy at the world's best universities and you can read every book on giving, attend all the summits that you want, and still never know how to decolonize philanthropy. Because the very canon of philanthropy is, it's steeped in the same colonial lens it claims to challenge, which is power disguised as benevolence. So you can't really unlearn empire by studying its textbooks. But for me, I truly believe that true decolonization actually begins with when we step outside the frame and when we unlearn, we listen and reimagine from the margins. So when you ask this question, Lola, we're not just questioning how money moves, but how meaning moves as well. Like who defines what counts as help, who is positioned as the helper, and who gets to tell the story of change as well. And it's really important to understand that long before the word philanthropy existed, communities across the world actually practiced forms of collective care, kinship and solidarity that asked not for credit, but for balance. And decolonizing philanthropy, I guess, begins with remembering that these traditions never needed to be invented by wealth. They were always about being human. It was all about humanity. And modern philanthropy emerged alongside colonial expansion. So there were missionary schools, there were medical charities and development funds, and they worked hand in hand with empire as well, framing the colonized world as a field of moral uplift and not political repair. So the logic was paternalistic. We have the resources in the global north, and they have the needs. We bring the civilization, and they receive it. Those hierarchies still persist, not through open domination, but through coloniality, which is described as the ongoing patterns of power that decide whose knowledge counts, whose suffering is visible, and whose voice is actually credible. And endowments were built on extraction, and they still dictate the terms of social good. So the rhetoric of empowerment assumes expertise flows north to the south, when in truth, communities have always been, the architects of their own survival and their own development. And one of the other things I wanted to just talk about was the soft power and narrative control. So today, philanthropy functions as a soft power. It shapes agendas, it shapes research, and even moral vocabulary as well. When funding decides which issues are urgent, when voices are legitimate, when philanthropy becomes an instrument of control. The West or the North not only funds solutions, it actually prescribes what poor looks like, and therefore what help should look like. And then poverty becomes aesthetic. It's an image to justify intervention. And I'm sure that we've all seen that with a lot of the global charities. This is how moral authority is actually produced, not by justice, but by the narrative control. Even when donors adapt the language of equity or decolonization, they often keep hold of the storyteller's pen. And part of the problem is that the global north has prescribed, what poor means and what it should look like. The image of a hungry child, the barren field, the developing village, all framed through a Western gaze. When you define what poverty is, you also claim the right to define what fixing it actually looks like. And that's how control is justified. So if the global north owns the narrative of deprivation, it also owns the blueprint for salvation. And that's the quiet violence of philanthropy's colonial inheritance. It doesn't just redistribute wealth, it redistributes meaning, deciding whose lives are legible as in need and whose interventions are deemed as solutions. So when we talk about confrontation and dismantling, decolonizing philanthropy requires more than inclusion or reform. It asks us to actually reimagine the architecture of giving itself. Confrontation means asking uncomfortable questions, where did this wealth come from? Who decides what impact it like? Which worldviews are legitimized? Which are dismissed as emotion or tradition or lack of capacity? So dismantling means centering relational accountability over institutional performance, models of giving grounded in mutuality and repair rather than saviorism. It means communities define their priorities, they control the resources and tell their own stories without needing permission to exist or to speak. And one of the fundamental things I wanted to address was also unrestricted funding and decision-making power when it comes to philanthropy. So unrestricted funding is one step forward, I think, to liberation. It's what trust looks like when translated into structure. And project-based funding says, we'll help, but only on your terms. Whereas unrestricted funding says, what freedom looks like, and you don't owe us anything. You don't owe us the proof. So decolonization here means shifting from compliance to autonomy. It asks donors to surrender their control, to value process over product, and see accountability not just as a report, but as a relationship. And we're already seeing glimpses of this. And I think a really good example is All We Can, where I work, if I could just give that example. It's an organization that's reimagining what partnership means in practice. So instead of short-term project-based grants, we build long-term relationships with our local partners, offering flexible, unrestricted funding, grounded in trust. The local organizations actually set the priorities, they define success, and they hold the power to adapt as the context changes. So they and their communities are in control of their development. It's philanthropy that listens rather than instructs, that sees partnership not as oversight, but as an accompaniment. And this is what it looks like when giving becomes an act of solidarity rather than control. And one of the last things I wanted to address was the ethical storytelling and the representation. So too often philanthropy turns people into symbols of need, of progress, of resilience, flattening their lived experience into narrative currency. So ethical storytelling actually demands narrative sovereignty, the right to tell or withhold one story, the right to refuse spectacle, the right to be represented as whole, complex, and capable. So storytelling can either reproduce hierarchy or restore dignity. The question is always who benefits from the telling. So as I close my part of the conversation, I just want you to remember that decolonizing philanthropy is not a metaphor. It's a practice of repair. It's unlearning the impulse to save and rediscovering the obligation to stand alongside. The task is not perfect, but I think it's really important that we leave today perhaps knowing that philanthropy is the love of humanity. It begins not when we give, but when we listen, return, and let go. And I really do hope that today you leave this space a little more unsettled, a little more curious, and a little more courageous in your thinking. Because to be truly decolonial is to question what we've been taught to see as natural, inevitable, or benevolent. It's to think provocatively, to learn humbly, and to act with accountability, because dismantling empire begins not only with power, but with the thoughts that we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Preet. Lots of reactions in the chat, especially during the last part of your remarks around storytelling. So I'm going to put a prompt in the chat about what resonated with so many people. Please do use the reply function to share your thoughts in that chat. And we will move on to our last speaker before we really do open it up and get to hear from everyone in the audience today. Our last panelist is Ellen Brooks. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Village Capital. Her full bio will be shared in the chat as well. So Ellen, my first question for you is, what does decentering colonially driven financial models and recentering multifaceted understandings of community support, care, and responsibility look and feel like?
Thanks, Lola, and thank you, everyone, and especially to the brilliant colleagues who have gone before me, because I'm going to weave together some of the threads of what everyone has said. But I especially want to contextualize that just as aid is an imperial tool, the financial markets, our modern financial systems, modern economic theory are all also tools of imperialism and were developed, created, and designed in the colonial era. And the Marshall Plan was already mentioned. Going back to 1944 is a very important date in modern financial history, because this is the Bretton Woods Conference. Bretton Woods is a resort in New Hampshire. That's what it's named for. And this is the creation of the sort of global monetary system as we know it. So it's the creation of the World Bank. It's the creation of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. And it's also the shift at the end of World War II from the world reserve currency, moving from the British pound to the US dollar. And for the world reserve currency means that every country, every central bank of every country in the world is required to hold a certain amount of that currency for trade, commerce, exchange. And so the shift from the British pound and the UK as the center to the United States as the center and is an exorbitant privilege that the United States government and the United States as a country has, because basically every single country in the world is required to hold dollars. And that means that the US gets extremely favorable terms both on its lending as well as on the debt that it issues. So this is all happening in 1944. And as we know, most of the world is still living under colonial rule. And so the people who are at the table to make those decisions around those instruments and the systems are not representative of the global South at all, but certainly not representative of the entire world. And so that it's important to read financial markets and financial systems and economic theory through a post-colonial lens, because it often doesn't get done because financial markets are seen to be objective because there's a lot of math involved. There's this concept of a free market where markets operate without intervention. That is not true. There is no such thing as a free market. There is always some sort of government intervention in a market. And therefore, there's always some sort of decision being made outside the numbers. And so you can call them assumptions, you can call them externalities, you can call them not having to account for or measure negative consequences of an investment or a loan. You can call it things that are not measured in the global GDP equations, such as human happiness, the labor produced at home, raising families. These things are simply not accounted for. And so there's a tremendous amount of choice that went into the creation of the systems that we sort of, the media, politicians, economists hold up as this like universal truth, when the reality is it's built on a lot of mythology. And the way that it's been weaponized has been to maintain power dynamics, much like the aid systems. And so I want to set the aid system as a component of sort of global finance, because when we talk about aid, we're primarily talking about grant funding. And so grant funding is, one financial tool. You also have lending or debt, which is when you have a loan between two parties, a borrower and a lender. And then you also have equity or investment, where you have a company that is giving a share to someone else in exchange for cash and ownership. And so those are the basic tools. Equity and debt have been around for a long time, equity for hundreds of years, debt for thousands of years. And they've been mobilized as the tools in our global financial markets, in our modern financial system, on the investment and financial market side. So when we think about like the whole suite available, you have equity, debt, and grants. And one of the things I want to position is, as we talk about the colonial heritage of capitalism and capitalism being inherently extractive, what I want to position here is that philanthropy is very much a tool of that extractive capitalist model. And to move away from that old paradigm of I'm going to make a lot of money and get very, very rich and not really think about the consequences at all of how I make all of that money, how I extract resources that are mine, how I underpay labor, all these extractive mentalities, then I'm going to decide to give some of it back to the things that I think need help. And so there's this like retained power dynamic of the person who got very, very rich on the work, the labor, the resources of others, all of a sudden has been endowed with this magical power to give back and help people. And this is something that I think we need to really be more honest about, is that the power dynamics, in fact, have not been removed. And so what I see as a solution and as like a vision for us is to think in the middle, is to think about making sort of money, making economic returns, having economic sovereignty in a way that is sustainable, so it's revenue generating, so that you're not constantly requiring someone to come in and give you grant funding, because grant funding is inherently sustainable. There needs to be some kind of exchange that happens where I really agree with Jaipreet, like this concept of unrestricted grant funding is a step in the right direction. But what if we were able to give resources back to the communities, give communities the financing that they need, and then allow them to generate their own growth and not extract that growth from those communities? And so that's somewhere in the middle where there's some requirements for grant funding, there's requirements for investment, there's probably some requirements for loans, but thinking about all these tools operating more symbiotically with one another instead of I'm going to get really rich and extract a lot and make a lot of money through equity and debt, and then I'm going to give it away through grants. But really thinking how do we bring these pieces together? So That's something for us to think about. That's something we're actively thinking about at Village Capital. So I will use the sort of example of Village Capital to show how we're addressing this, but there's lots of other examples, and happy to spend as much time going through lots of other examples. I would say what Village Capital founded with, and which is, it's like such a pleasure to run this organization, was actually bringing finance in the venture capital space. So this is privately held investments, early stage, higher risk investments vis-a-vis a public equity, like a Coca-Cola stock or a Ford stock that's listed on a public exchange. This is early stage startup companies. Think a Facebook or a Google before that they went public. So these like small stage companies that have potentially a high growth trajectory. Venture capital is also, it's a tool of capitalism. It's inherently extractive. There's a tremendous amount of need for growth. The terms are very top down. And what Village Capital did in its founding about 16 years ago was try to build a venture capital model that actually flipped those power dynamics. And instead of the decisions of who would get investment being made by some investor in an ivory tower in Silicon Valley or in New York, instead what Village Capital did was, through its Fund One, went through and created in every ecosystem where they were going to make investments in different sectors. It made 90 investments in Fund One. They ran acceleration programs with startups and small business owners in the community. And then they got to the end of that acceleration process, and they had also embedded education for business owners on finance and investment and venture capital. And so they're training entrepreneurs also to think like investors. And at the end of this process, the cohort actually got to vote on who got the investment. So the top two that were voted on by their peers received the investment. And so all 90 investments in Fund One were made using this peer due diligence model. And the reason I use this is because this fund was created in 2014. It is now in its final year. And it has returned most money to its capital, to its investors, excuse me. And that's what's called a DPI of 1, or over 1x. DPI of 1 means that you're returning money to investors. And what's so important about that is most impact investment, so thinking outside the norms of traditional top-down financing, that colonialist model, most impact investing, when you start to consider other consequences of the investment, value for the community, social impact, environmental impact, all that stuff, in the early days was operating at a loss. It was not returning money to its investors. And what this fund has shown is that, in fact, the community can make just as good or better decisions than other impact investors. And so it has proven this hypothesis that communities actually know what's best for them and how to be invested in. And so I will say that peer due diligence model, asking communities what they need, giving them what they need, all of that is what we want to grow and expand on, and what Village Capital has built all of its work on across the years. But there's something very important in all of that, which is this return to economic sovereignty that is embedded in that, and thinking about how do we invest in communities, give them what they need from a financial perspective, and then walk away and let them retain that growth that is generated in their communities. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ellen. Well, lots to learn from what you just shared. Very interesting to hear about the work of Village Capital too in detail. I'll put another prompt in the chat for people to share their takeaways from Ellen's remarks. And I must say, the through line between all of the panelists' remarks was pretty impressive. So I do want to give a moment to see if either of you or any of you wanted to respond to each other's remarks. If there's any points that came up that you wanted to highlight or further link together. And then we also have some early questions in the chat that we can jump to too for specific panelists. But any reactions between the four of you first?
I can jump in.
Yes.
Thank you to everyone. It was really important for me to hear all of the remarks and all of the framings. And I do, as you were saying, Lola, see a through line. I want to, though, perhaps for all of us, make a distinction between where we are and where we want to be, and a transition period in between. Because I imagine a world where we entirely have dismantled aid, we entirely have dismantled philanthropy, we've entirely dismantled capitalism, is in world that I imagine. And in that world, and I know that in this moment, which I hope is a transitional period, and not a moment where we continue, I do believe that there are ways that we can make an intervention in some of these existing structures, systems, institutions. So as Jaipreet was saying around philanthropy, at the Black Feminist Fund, we have, created funds, the Sustain Fund, which is an 8-year core flexible unrestricted fund. We're funding around the world to groups that often haven't, we may be the first funder, unregistered groups because of the ways in which criminalization of our communities happen. And in that way, I hope that we are making an intervention. Someone said breaking the rules so that new ways of doing things can emerge. And I hope in the world I want to create, the Black Feminist Fund is not a permanent institution. It's one that's meeting a particular need in this moment and making that intervention, and one where philanthropy wouldn't exist, and that we can go back to some of the ideas that Jaipreet mentioned around collective care, mutual aid, solidarity. It was an African freedom fighter from Mozambique, Samora Machel, who said that solidarity is not an act of charity. It's different people fighting on different fronts for the same objective, and the objective being liberation, justice, equality. I'm paraphrasing, that wasn't an exact quote. I'll find it and post it in the chat. And I think we shouldn't also perhaps conflate international cooperation with aid, because cooperation absolutely must exist, not only between states and all, but between communities. We have to find ways that societies are able to cooperate, and ways in which we can create a world where many worlds are possible. But and so cooperation, absolutely. Aid, I'm not so sure. I'll stop here.
Great, Hakima. Thank you. So much more food for thought, and definitely good prompts there. Really good prompts there. Any other reactions from the fellow panelists to each other, or even to what Hakima just said?
I'm happy to jump in.
Please.
Yeah, Hakima, very much agree with most of what you said. I would love to live in a world where philanthropy doesn't exist, and I think a lot of that comes down to even what you were saying, Ellen. It's just getting to a place, I guess, where communities have their own social enterprises, etc. Right? So even organizations like All We Can don't have to exist because they don't need us. And I think that's a place where I know that some of the work that we're doing with our local partners is supporting them and them creating whatever social enterprises actually work in their context with their communities, so that they could have all the unrestricted funds they need. And organizations like us don't need to exist. And I think that's the goal for me. And yeah, but I don't know if it will happen in my lifetime, but hopefully we can put the stepping stones in place for it to happen.
What's so interesting about this remark of philanthropy not needing to exist anymore too is that there was a time where humanitarians used to say that we're here to work ourselves out of a job. I stopped hearing that a long time ago. Now these organizations are bigger than some countries' GDPs, right? So it's just so interesting how that can easily get lost in terms of the original spirit of humanitarianism. and where we are today. So appreciate you both saying that about your philanthropic funds, and I do wish more and more humanitarians would think like that as well. Any other reactions from the panelists? And then Ellen, please.
I just quickly, I had written down something Hakima said that I didn't cite, but it's very important. It's not that there isn't money. This is really key because and I won't go into the whole details of it, but central banks have figured out that they can just print money and send it into our financial markets. This is what happened in the United States in 2008 called quantitative easing, where the government central bank, the Fed, was printing money to buy securities off the market. So there is no such thing as there's not enough money. The defense budgets are increasing, aid budgets are going down. It's about incentives, it's about power, and it's about changing these systems that we have to participate in now. But I would say that we have to be in transition. We are in transition to a better world because we're not going to survive otherwise. And I think when you think about what's happening with climate change and you think about how you build resilience in communities with climate change, it is going hyper local. It is returning to indigenous knowledge. It is centering what is happening at the community level and then figuring out how to build resilience in that, because we've gone away globalization. We've sort of sucked resources out of like, let's say, frontline or resource-rich environments for this like global profitization of resources. And now it's time to return to the community and to allow communities to generate profit from their own resources and allow communities to manufacture for themselves. To your point, RB, about decolonizing industrialization, thinking about what localized manufacturing looks like, think about what it means to, if you live in the global north, not eat bananas anymore because that doesn't make sense for you. But eating what comes from your backyard, regenerative agriculture, what does that look like? How do we invest in that? And so I think there is not a money question. It's a systems change question. And we start with spaces like this, the alt work everybody's doing, of reimagining what that could look like and imagining a world that is, living in harmony, both with people and the planet and our ecosystems. And there are people doing work on that already. And I think it's about coming together collectively and in our communities where we live to ensure that people have this alternative vision, because that's the first step.
Great, thanks, Ellen. RB, anything you wanted to add to the group?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I agree with a lot of the other speakers have said, and it's really refreshing to hear, these alternatives that are already being done. And I think, for me, I'm just reflecting also on, the title of this session, right? Beyond Aid, which is why, for me, like the three examples that I proposed earlier are truly ones that go beyond aid. So decolonized industrialization, political movements as humanitarian actors, and grassroots markets that arise from the rule-breaking behaviors of refugees and other marginalized communities. These are things that are beyond aid as we know it, that can get us, as Hakima said, in this transition to aid that we fight for. And I think if we continue to imagine and support these alternatives that not just shift power, but take power, then I think I have hope that we can reclaim this problematic notion of aid as we know it and change it to something that can really bring liberation and justice for everyone.
Lola, can I say one small thing?
Yes, please.
I promise it will be super short because I know we want to go to. But just to Jaipreet, you said you're not sure it will happen in our lifetime, or in your lifetime, and I think you're younger than I am. I have to believe that it will happen in our lifetime because I do think that the contradictions of this current moment are unsustainable. Every day, this capitalist economic system, imperialist economic system, is killing people and planet. And I think that, so when I talk of transition, I don't think this is, and I said it in the first remarks, and it sounded like doom and gloom, but I don't think we have time. I do think that And Jamil asked the question in the chat about institutions. We need to think about institutions that are not permanent, that are intended to serve a need in this moment, and that those allow us to get to an entirely different economic, political, social system for all of us.
Can I respond quickly?
Yes.
I'm so sorry about the noise in the background. No, Hakeem, I really appreciate you saying that. And I think maybe my pessimistic view comes from the fact that I see so many, I don't see a lot of organizations having these conversations. So it's really hard to then imagine, how can we get to that place? So I'll try and be a bit more hopeful, but I think if I can hear more conversation, not just conversation, but people actually implementing this change, because I think there's a lot of people do a lot of talking, but not enough implementing and any action. And I think that's where I'm kind of like just stuck in that pessimistic view potentially. But no, I hope it does happen in our lifetime. So yeah, thank you.
This is a perfect segue for breakout groups, where we're going to push for you to have those discussions with each other, to think about some of those small actions you can be taking in your day-to-day. You can also still jump back in on any of the things you heard from today's speakers. One will be in each of the rooms. We're going to go into 4 rooms. I'm going to call it out that I know people like to disappear when breakout groups happen. Please don't disappear. Please join the breakout group, and we will come back in plenary and answer the many questions that are in the chat. So I'm leaving the questions in the chat as a cliffhanger to make sure you come back and participate in your breakout group, and then we'll have our full discussion. So with that, we'll be divided out into breakout groups. Please do have a conversation. You can use prompts. We'll share some through in the chat. And we want to just have you build community and discuss with each other. So we'll take about 15 minutes to do that, and then we will come back into plenary to go through. Before we do a recap of anything you guys want to bring from your breakout group into the plenary, I do want to take us back to some of the questions that came through during the panel. And Arby, there was like 3 or 4 that were directed towards you. So I'm just going to kind of summarize a few points that people were hoping to get your response on, including why the lack of aid would necessarily default into the far right and international corporations taking over, this tension between destroying capitalist systems while reclaiming, and then this notion of, projects and grants and this still being the way funding works and how that's addressed. And then, is it really possible to transform aid through reclaiming it? Wouldn't it be required for those who control it to share power differently? And how do we make that happen? So some general reflections to those 3 questions would be great.
So I can go really quickly, and we've discussed some of this actually in our small group. But just to say, I am optimistic about reclaiming it, right? In terms of kind of like the far right question, my fear is that if we don't fight for this idea of international cooperation and solidarity, whatever we may call it aid, we may call it something else because we don't like the word aid, etc. If we don't fight for it, I fear that the narrative of, anti-international cooperation, anti-global solidarity that is being perpetuated mostly by the far right, but also others, will gain ground and will become kind of like the dominant narrative that prevails. And as someone who believes in international cooperation, I don't want that to happen. And in terms of kind of like reclaiming aid, it sounds cosmetic, but I am really looking at like a deeper kind of like reclaiming of this notion. So if you can see in the 3 alternatives that I propose, these 3 go beyond aid, go beyond projects and grants and even alternative grant funding mechanisms. I've spoken about decolonizing project management in 2019. But I want us to move beyond that and think about how can we induce transformation beyond aid, which is why I spoke about decolonizing industrialization, political movements as humanitarian actors, and grassroots markets, because there are ways to kind of like transform beyond this. So I am remaining optimistic and reclaiming it substantively, not just in name. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Arby. Ellen, there were two questions more or less for you as well. One about the approach of supporting communities to determine their own economic growth, but curious how, if at all, this intersects with direct cash transfer models. Do they align, build on, or do they align or build on each other? And then this person also asked about your familiarity with the transformative 25 model. And there's a link in the chat. So those two for you as well.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with Transformative 25. Thank you for the link. I will return with a link that I dropped in the chat on donut economics, which is a way of envisioning economics and planet within our planetary bounds, but also with a very strong social foundation. So how do you live within a donut with the social foundation being at the center and the planetary bounds being on the outside? This is a now widely adopted economic theory by alternative economists, those that want to change the power dynamics and shift the world to be more sustainable and to return to community-centered investing and community-centered needs. So I just to highlight that because we talked about it in the breakout as well, is like, what are these alternatives? And how do we promote a well-being economy, and how do we center, the planet and human well-being in the way that we measure success and progress? On the point of cash transfers, I think actually this is something that I talk about, having come from the humanitarian sector or having spent some time in the humanitarian sector, and now working back in the private sector. Cash transfers are such an important case study because the data and the randomized control trials, and over and over again, we see that people know what to do best with what their needs are. People know how to address their need best. And yet the aid sector embedded the same kind of colonialist, paternalist ideologies or prevention of moving to this model by demanding a ton of research, from shifting from grants, in-kind donations to just giving cash away to people. And so I do think that they are tied. I think that it's very important to reference the fact that just like cash transfers, we have this, it's sort of the other link to universal basic income is a very similar one, of thinking about how when you give people enough to meet their needs, they actually are able to make better decisions. It's more sustainable, and we have a much more symbiotic economic environment and are able to take care of ourselves better. So I think the underpinning of that is trust. And the underpinning of that is how do we build these relationships? How do we promote these relationships from the grassroots, from the grounds up, to the intermediaries, to the funds, to the functions that can sort of help to build more of these solutions for the communities that need them. And yeah, the most important thing is trust and embedding that and creating the spaces for that to happen, and for people in power decision-making roles to be to walk away and to enable that through trust-building relationships.
Great, thank you so much, Ellen. So we've got an insight from one of the breakout groups in the chat that now has us really wanting to hear about how some of these discussions went. So anyone from the audience, panelists, anybody want to share a piece from their breakout group that really resonated with them, something that they want to use to further challenge the group or provoke some discussion in the broader group? Adam.
Thank you.
Sorry, Lourdes after. I didn't see you. So yes, you'll be up next.
Oh, sorry. I think I just want to add on that, the question that I asked, and we also talked about that in the breakout room. Can't remember his name, but he talked about neoliberalism and not primarily the far right when it comes to giving far right a space to fill the vacuum of taking away aid. But just to give a bit nuance on that question from our perspective, is that I come from a rural town that within my lifetime has shifted. So I'm from Sweden, by the way, that has shifted from traditional left-wing values, very workers, solidarity, and internationalism. When I came to the world, to becoming almost entirely dominated by the far right, and in the community, people say that if you ask them, they're probably going to say, why should we send money or aid elsewhere when we can't even pay our rent or afford food? But this feeling, it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from, again, like decades of capitalism, capital accumulations, and all that. So I used to react. I think I didn't have the chance to speak in my breakout room. I didn't raise the hand, so it's my bad. But we need to be careful when blaming far-right voters in a way to not create the problem even worse, because most of them are poor, most of working class and they've been exploited in their turns in their countries. So I think if you ask them, many will say again that foreign aid should be cut, but that doesn't originate. Like, that's not their story. That's just a neoliberal narrative that collaborates with the far right by redirecting anger towards migrants, which is breaking down international solidarity instead of toward the real root cause, and which is capitalism, capital accumulation. And also, thank you so much for the panelists. I enjoyed all the speeches. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Adam. Thanks for sharing from your personal experience. Hakima, your hand went up and then down. Was it going to be in response to Adam? You're good? Okay. Lourdes, you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, that was such a good point that I mean, I don't want to change the subject, but okay, I'll stick to what came out of our group and then I'll hopefully bounce back to what Adam was saying. There was a point at the end that we were just asking our question about, which was living versus surviving. How do we look from feminism, right, to care for ourselves, to thrive, not to survive in these contexts on the one hand? And I think one of the, before the session closed, I wanted to talk about how can we move towards systems of emancipation, right? Because I think that also speaks to what was just being said before. And my own experience in the US, I'm from Puerto Rico, and we can see like the remilitarization of Puerto Rico that's happening. Obviously, everyone has seen like the far right pivot of the United States, while we're also seeing like this insane accumulation of billionaires. And I'm just wondering how we can meet these two concepts in the middle, right? Because I feel like we're needing to go to spaces where we can thrive instead of survive, but at the same time, like we're also confronting existential threats in the form of such almost absurdity, right? These concentrations of wealth in the form of billionaires, Puerto Rico being remilitarized after expelling the US military. So my interest is like what can we do, recognizing that we need to also thrive, but we also have like this huge military industrial complex in front of us. And it's not just reclaiming industrialization, it's also responding to these disenfranchised people who in the end probably are very much our allies. I mean, I have an example from the US with the person who went to Klansmen to talk to them and de-radicalize them. And it was a Black man who put himself on the line to do that, which he shouldn't have had to do that because obviously that should have never happened, but that's what he did. And is that what we're going to do in order to shift this? I don't know, just reflections. So thanks for letting me speak.
Thank you for sharing, Lourdes. Good to hear the reflections from the breakout group too, yeah. Anyone else want to share thoughts that came from the breakout
If I
group?
could quickly just respond to Lourdes's point about moving from systems where we survive to where we thrive.
Please.
I would just encourage you, just in terms of the practicality of the D20 week, to continue to join the sessions. And then on Saturday, we're going to have the Innovation and Reclamation Lab, which is really a time to reflect on all that we've learned in the foundations and the week, but also to look forward to what we want to build, what we want to support, what we want to actually thrive, and what are like the capabilities we have. So I would encourage you to, if you can, come to that Saturday workshop. It's going to be a half day, and we're really going to dig into what does this mean. So we're not, sometimes you get the opportunity to be in community and to talk, but then moving forward, we don't always have that time and capacity. And so what we're hoping to do is be able to have these conversations and then use that lab space to kind of launch forward into 2026, what we want to see happen.
Thank you, Sewa. Any other thoughts? Oh yes, and Adama just put the registration link for the Reclamation Lab. So please do take a moment to register if you're available to join us on Saturday. Any other thoughts from breakout groups or new questions that have come up, or just general thoughts you want to share here in the plenary? Madura.
Hi, I'm not switching on my camera because it's like almost 11 here. And
No requirement to do so. No requirement to do so.
yeah, I was also wondering, based on some of the discussions we had about reclaiming language and so on, that and I've been thinking about this a lot in my research, is how identity formation and meaning making is related to language and understanding. And unfortunately, a lot of us are forced to communicate in the colonizer's language. I come from India, so therefore I speak English. And it takes away a lot of the nuances. And I mean, we were specifically talking about queerness and transness and how Indigenous identities or the ways of living, ways of being translate or are need to be made legible by being confined within these terms, queer, trans, etc. And I think that applies to a lot of things when we talk about decolonizing, like language justice is such an important part of it, because this is how we foundationally make sense of the world around us. And a lot of things don't translate, but we are forced to make them legible in a different language in order to be not just to the colonizer. Even this conference is taking place in English because this is unfortunately the language that will make us understand between India and Philippines and Ethiopia much more than any other language. So I don't see it necessarily only as making legible to the colonizer, but also to each other. And I think that also results in some loss. And I just wonder how to go about it, how to sort of not have to make that effort in a foreign language to translate our experiences in some ways where there's always some loss.
Thank you so much, Madura. Not to continually push TDNs as a network, but we literally spent one whole Wednesday session talking about this, about language and how that is just at the root of everything, even just something as small as that, the language that we're using in our day-to-day and what that takes away from our ancestry and our history and all of those other impacts. So thanks for that reflection. I don't want to mispronounce your name, but your hand is up.
That's me. That has to be Ngidisa.
Please.
So this language conversation is one of my favorite because over and above, the curating and the emotional and the energetic labor you put into conversing in a language that, yes, allows for access, but also is the language of the colonizer. What we're doing with our curating is also curating out the wisdoms that are contained in the linguistic structures of my mother tongue is isiXhosa. So there is so much wisdom in like embedded into different, like just almost like little Easter eggs of wisdom within the language itself. Wisdoms around the understanding of the world, wisdoms around how to tend to the relational field, the connective tissue within society, wisdoms on how to tend to the earth, wisdoms on how to be in right relationship with society and the earth. And that is all the stuff that we're curating out of these decision-making spaces, out of these, of these very important spaces where the medium of instruction and the medium of communication is English. So I guess for me, that what the point I'm trying to make, sorry, I'm being wordy, is that the call for decoloniality is also a call to it's also an invitation to push epistemic justice. It's also an invitation to kind of draw light to, and put a light on the fact that, as I say, these wisdoms have been dismissed, curated out, undervalued, and actually a lot of the next right step is sitting there readily available within these wisdoms, which is again going back to earlier conversations around power and how do those who think they hold it how do they share it differently, and how do those who think they hold it and weaponize their resource in order to keep hold of it, to continue to hold of it, it's an invitation for that to be shared differently. And I guess, yeah, let me actually stop there because now I'm just rambling.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was great to hear that. Sewa, your response or follow-up? Your hands up.
Yes, it's a response. I really appreciate this line of conversation. And please, can you repeat your name for me? My colonized tongue, forgive me.
Yeah.
My name is Nritesa. It means in service.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. I wanted to respond to your provocation because I think it's so important because it's the idea of language, community, like where do you draw the line between what Arby talked about around having a global community learning from each other and understanding that globalization is really the highway of coloniality, right? The way we understand it now, versus like holding on to what your community knows, building your local community, like where is that balance, right? Because I also, for me, when I think of this like world that I envision that's liberated, that's just, it doesn't reflect the space where we're all in our own enclaves, but it also doesn't reflect the space that we're in currently. So it's like, it's hard, like, because all we know of how we like connect with one another is through this medium of coloniality, particularly like this Western European coloniality. It's so dominant. And so I'm always curious as to like, how do we imagine different? How do we move different? What does that look and feel like? What languages can that even like, do we create our new languages that, you know, I think there was some efforts to create like new languages that married different ones. I forget. I mean, there's like Swahili for Eastern Africa, but I feel like even in that there's loss, right? So how do you, like, where's the balance between like preserving what's, you know, vital to your culture and then also connecting across these perceived boundaries, right? To just be, because we're like humans, and even, you know, Nikos always reminds us, another TDN co-founder, of the more than human, right? So we're not even just talking about humans. Like, how do we connect even beyond who, like, the human experience? And so yeah, it's something that I do think a lot about. I'm really happy that you brought it. I don't expect anyone to have the answer, but it is something that I do think about quite a bit. If you have any thoughts, I'm not sure, but
Arby's been ready to jump in.
Sorry, I can't find the raise my hand button, so I'm gonna. No, thank you so much for that. I just wanted to share another provocation, right? One of my favorite quotes is from Immanuel Kant, and he says, "Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing has ever been made." And I think I really reflect on this because, you know, I think for a lot of progressive movements around the world, it is easy to fall into the trap of analysis paralysis and trying to find like the perfect language or the perfect action or the perfect solution. And I think if we might not get there to the perfect, right? But we can get to the good enough. And what I fear is that a lot of the enemies of liberation and justice are organizing and are getting power and are winning elections, and we can't get stuck in the search of perfection. And I think, in addition to balancing what was discussed earlier, I think we also need to strike a balance between critique and action. And I think, you know, this is great. Critique is always welcome and critique is always necessary, but there will be a time when we say, okay, now we must take action and now we must do something about it. And I think that is really important in the context because there is too much at stake in a world that is burning because of the climate crisis and as wars are going on and our rights are being eroded. There is too much at stake to be paralyzed. Yeah.
Thanks, Arby. Hakima first, I think, and Sewa, back to you.
Mine is maybe taking us a little bit back. It's just that, Adam, when you were talking about class solidarity across the global North and South, I wanted to bring something there around that interplay between fascism, authoritarianism, and class and economics that you were bringing up. And I absolutely, as I said, I think for what we need to be framing is international solidarity as action wherever we are towards the same objective. But when we think about loss based on this capitalist economic system, I go back to DRC, and we started the conversation in the DRC. 5.4 million people have died in the DRC. They're dying because of capitalism at its very base. The Congo is the place where most critical minerals exist. When Trump brokered some kind of deal, and he was very excited about it, one of the first things that happened was that Cobalt Metals, which is a mining company that's backed by US billionaires Bezos and Gates, signed an agreement with the DRC that positioned that firm to acquire this lithium deposits and all of these things. There is a multi-party, multi-country, there's a world war in the DRC, and everyone's benefiting from it other than the people of the Congo. And we've been letting this happen for so long. So it's difficult for me sometimes to hear how folks in the global north are now feeling the loss or of capitalism or the impacts of capitalism, and they turn to fascism. I believe that in the global north, there isn't a migrant problem, there's an imperialism problem. If we left the DRC alone, if the global north left most of us alone, the whole world would have to reorder. And indeed, I think that during this transition, it will be painful. But actually, it is so painful for so many of us right now. And I think eventually we could create a liberated order.
Thank you, Hakima. Sela?
Hakima said that so beautifully. Thank you for that reminder. And my point was to Arby's point earlier about, and it's related to what Hakima was just talking about, but not allowing our critiques to impede our movements and our actions. And I think what is so apparent to me from my lived experience is empire is so seductive in so many ways. And so if we aren't constantly unpacking it within us and in community, the interventions that we dream up, like even the expansiveness of our visions for the future, are going to be impacted by it, are going to be shaped by it. So while I agree with you that it's really important to act and move, I think it's just as important to have these spaces where we are like confronting what it means, because even in some of the most remote parts of the world, like because of the way that capitalism, like Western democracy, is marketed, it's seen as like this is the advancements towards modernity, right? Anyone else who doesn't move in this way, you're backwards. And so I think like we constantly have to be doing this work as well. And sometimes it seems like maybe it doesn't seem as like forward moving because the way we think of progress is also defined by like this Western like hellscape, you know? And so you always have to be moving in a particular way. So the way the right is moving, I don't think is necessarily the way that we should be moving, but I certainly agree that we shouldn't be paralyzed, you know, to the point where we're not doing anything. But I really think it's important that we're constantly like doing this work. As somebody who was born into empire, who has spent a significant amount of time in empire, I know it lives within me. And I know the work to undo it is going to be lifelong work. Thank you.
Thank you, Sela. Adam, reflection, and then invite anyone else who wanted to say anything to raise their hand before we start wrapping up. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to emphasize what Hakima said. I totally agree. I think it's just me reflecting on where I am, where I'm based, and how I can, impact on, like, how 100% support your reflection there, Hakima. I just reflect on how I can deal with the far right anger in my community. Because I think I grapple with these questions a lot. I try to at this stage, I've taken a pause on my entire family because they have turned so much to the far right. Because as soon as I tell them, if I use your words, Hakim, and tell them what you just said to me, I will push them even more further to the far right. So that is like that is my challenge, to communicate with them, to make them realize that we need to kind of turn off the taps or stop the taps. For example, as a perfect example with Congo. So yeah, yes, thank you for that. I'm just wanted to give a reflection on where I am and how I deal with, a lot of friends and family that I'm losing day by day to the far right, which are not always in their control. Because if you look at the media, just turn on the newspapers or TV, they are doing the job for them. Because if they take in what the TV and journals tells them, they will by default turn to far right if they don't know enough. So yeah.
Thanks, Adam. Lourdes?
Thanks, and I'll be faster because I know everyone we're short on time, but it kind of speaks to what I wanted to say this last point, because I was thinking of stories and art, how we have. I hope we can also think about how we can start. I don't know, making the stories that sound like bringing people to, like, holding people to account. And I hear you, Arby, about like we need to not over criticize, but like we haven't simultaneously done enough critique, right? Because as Hakim was saying, like this has been going on for decades. And I don't know if one of the latest documentaries I saw a couple of years ago was of the genocide in Namibia, right? And then all of the conceptualization around like the heroes of the West being things like Columbus, like instead of saying that he invaded the Americas and then questioning the Americas, we're still sharing these narratives of like, yes, he discovered, like, no, he triggered a genocide, right? And so what are we doing to make the stories reflect accountability without alienating people, but also making people more uncomfortable? I mean, yeah, comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, how we're all embodying and living and replicating colonial imperial harms. Like I know that I also, as we were saying already, like have a lot to unlearn constantly. But then also, how can we shift ownership of the blame? Like the minerals things, that's Apple, that's Gates who's now telling us that actually we shouldn't be focusing on climate change because the real issue is going to be feeding people. We're not able to feed people because your AI systems are taking up the water. No, like so where can we like also reclaim the stories and shift the stories, but then look at those other people's who should be shifting and who should be held to blame. I don't know. That's a big question for me, and I hope that art is a way to do that, because I really think that art is like gonna liberate us.
Thank you, Lourdes. We are at time. There's still great discussion happening in the chat. And with that spirit, invite you all to come back tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday. It's D20 week, so we're doing sessions like this all week with a great reclamation lab on Saturday. So please do register. I think someone will drop the link in the chat. A little bit about tomorrow's session, Beyond the Binary. It's going to be looking at colonial binaries, man and woman, human and non-human, Black and white, developed and underdeveloped, and how it's formed the bedrock of our global system. So we're going to try to understand the complex and often subterranean interplay of these false binaries. More about this at the link at our website. It's going to be stellar. The week is going to be stellar. Thank you guys for kicking it off with so much energy and insight. It's been really wonderful to spend the past 2 hours with you guys. It doesn't feel like it's been 2 hours. It's been great. So thanks for sticking around, and really do hope to see you all later in the week. Take care. And when you, when you exit, there will be an exit survey. So when you're closing Zoom, please do take the survey for us. It will help with future sessions and planning.
And also, Lola, if people do want to stay a little bit later, I'm good to stay. If you still want to talk, it's completely up to you, because we know it's been a 2-hour session. But if there's anything that you wanted to say that you didn't get a chance to, feel free. We'll stick around for a little bit. Thank you so much, Lola. This is a wonderful, wonderful session. Thank you all for joining. We've popped the link in for tomorrow's session, same time. And yeah, we hope to see you all there. Take good care, and do fill out the survey if you're leaving now.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for creating this space. Definitely we'll be back and look forward to being back.
Wonderful.
Thanks,
Thank you for
Laura.
all of your
I wanted to
interventions,
speak
your
to
thoughts.
your point. Sorry,
Oh,
like
okay. Go ahead, please, please.
if you, yeah. So I think I said it in the breakout room. I'm an applied theatre maker, so, and as I specialize in theatre that attempts to address issues that are relevant to communities. And so for my PhD, I'm looking at theatre plays that are made by young people from the townships of Cape Town, and plays that explore issues of GBV or to educate about gender-based violence. And so what you see with this, with just what young people are doing is even, I mean, the colonial structure of Cape Town is the fact that it attracts the West, right? It's the, and so local people don't have access to housing. So the Black people are still in the townships predominantly. So what you see with young people, you see them finding their voice through theatre, even though I critique the fact that I'm very mindful that at the dangerous, the single story of being Black, that we are stories of pain, and the fact that they're showcasing this GBV, but with not much critical engagement of how the GBV in South Africa thrives, right? In terms of the colonial rapes, were not called colonial rapes, right? And when we South Africa had the Truth and Reconciliation session, that it didn't say that the violence that was GBV was GBV. It was just, racial segregated violence. So it's been interesting to be in conversation with the young people in their works and analyze their work. And I think the funding model of the fact that the plays then go into the city center. So it becomes a social mobility and a giving back of this Baxter Theatre, which is predominantly has a white audiences. So I'm also like quite skeptical that Black people get to showcase their pain in predominantly this thing that we are transforming as South Africa when we're still grappling with neoliberal policies. And I mean, and Africa has got the youngest population. So it's essential to hear what young people are saying, but I'm just sitting with that work. And so when you mentioned the arts, and I know it has changed, but it can raise quite important questions about political economy, structure, and neoliberalism in the context of where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so powerful too. I mean, you're reminding me of the American discourse too around Black cinema as well. The same, I don't remember the director's name, but I mean, the latest movie that I saw was by Michael B. Jordan, and it was Sinners, and he was reclaiming this story of post Civil War South, like in the segregation era, using vampires, like Irish vampires and not settlers, but the plantation owners. And I remember watching these sessions or interviews with the directors where they would say like we're not just stories of pain and suffering, but of resilience, and like despite this pain or of slavery, like we have other stories that we were telling between ourselves even during that era. And I don't know if it was Frederick Douglass that was saying something that like the freedom, like it was through singing, right? That he said that he dreamed of freedom through singing, I think is what it was. So I think it's interesting to think about like what are we showing, what are we replicating, and but also how can we bring honor to the stories of those things that did happen, but still also like challenge those stories that we're receiving. I think that happens in Puerto Rico too, and I don't have the answers, but hopefully, I don't know, maybe like it's going to be social media. I know that like young people tell stories to each other through things like Snapchat. So how can we start using the tools that they use themselves to, start shifting the narrative? Like everyone says social media is like destroying our self-worth and stuff, but what if it's being told, what if we start capturing that to tell the stories of like the young people themselves that want to share these other stories, no? So, I think it's awesome what you're doing.
I may add as well, for me, that it's so difficult to survive capitalism like in the sphere that we're in general, and this like development, humanitarian aid, caring about people. So when you add being an artist, if that's your angle, like how do you survive, right? Because I feel like whiteness, the power structure, they have ways to survive where they can put a dot on a piece of canvas and someone's going to pay $50,000 for it. You can survive, right? But I feel like people at the margins who have something really relevant to say about the conditions of their lives, you're not given the means to do that and survive. And so oftentimes you have to make this really difficult decision around like, do you continue with your art that you feel like has something really powerful to say, or do you make sure that you can survive this, right? So I think when I think about the arts, that's a piece that always comes to mind, like this decision you have to make about, can you pursue what for a lot of people, at least artists that I know, are really passionate about their work, but the reality is nobody's going to pay you, honestly, a lot of times to do this work that you think is so important. And so there's definitely like a lot of, because some of the art I see on, like, I don't get everything, but some things I'm like, and people make very good livings off of this. Like and then there's a whole other conversation about how a lot of famous artists are actually like CIA plants, and nobody was really paying this money for, I don't know, it's a little conspiracy theorist, but like that they were asked to provide a certain type of narrative for empire, right? And so that's how they've been able to finance like their livelihoods. I don't know. But yeah, that's something that comes to mind. But I think I really like Lourdes's thinking around like how can we use the tools to tell a different story, and something that we're also thinking about is how do we even create tools, because communications is so important in terms of like how we understand the world, what we think of the future. So, and we oftentimes we don't control any of the means of communication. So if they went to shut down Zoom tomorrow, or like there's so many like tools that we use that we just don't control. So how can we think of maybe developing tools, right, where we can actually control the media that we use to tell these stories as well? Anyone who feels, this is TDN style. So in TDN, you just, speak when you want to. You don't really need to raise your hand. You can if it makes you feel more comfortable, but feel free.
No, but sometimes we say we bully other people to talk, kind of. No, not really bully, but we call on other people sometimes. But not today. Not to the uninitiated. I wanna just share a narrative with this young person. When I interviewed her, and I said to her, so you need to tell me, why did you decide to actually do this play about gender-based violence? Because for me, I thought like it's just a spectacle of South African narratives because we struggle with GBV. And she said something so powerful. She said to me, what happened is like I grew up with my stepdad abusing my mother. And my mother comes from the tradition that you must keep quiet and not speak, right, as a woman. And so she never told anyone about this story, but she got to observe it. So she says to me, when I could actually, I'm getting a lump in my throat. When I am on stage, I start to speak for my mother. That this play makes me actually allow my mother to have a voice. And because I thought, man, you're saying it heals you, and but this is such an English, and she speaks Xhosa. This is such an English, eclectic social media. Oh, we're healing. But when she actually spoke about the embodiment of healing, that through that she can have an intergenerational conversation and get her mom to speak on stage through that story. I was like, okay, cool, I get it. So it goes beyond just the money issue there's other priorities, I think, for young people, that the theater makes them have a voice in a place where they're so marginalized and they're fully charged. They can't access the city like Europeans who come to Cape Town, because you must be in the township, and neoliberalism, you can't afford to actually stay in the city. So it goes beyond also but the financial capacity to still believe that this thing does something for me beyond that. I think, I just want to, sorry for crying. It happens a lot.
Please don't be sorry for crying. I cry all the time. That story made me cry. Like just being able to have someone, your own daughter, be able to tell a story that liberates you. Like talk about like how empowering that is. Like the next generation being able to, I don't know, have a space to give voice to that. There are no words, right? And also, you make me think of how storytelling was ours before anything colonial. Like theater was always ours before it was the most human way of showing like our humanity, right? So yeah, the money part, it's capitalism's way of making us ask like how do we survive under capitalism? But yeah, I think we have to remember, I think I'm reading The Artist's Way, and it's this book that talks about like how to reclaim your creativity, and she's saying that remember the why, the money will come. I know it's a lot of faith, but
I agree. I do agree, and thank you, Ongezwa. Am I pronouncing your name properly? I'm also Sawa, by the way. I realize I don't have my name, so I just say Decoloniality Network.
Yeah, you did well.
Thank you for that, because I agree. I think it's a part of the healing that we have to do, and it was Adam. I'd put it in the chat too in response to how do you have like I don't have a lot of conversations with far right people, so hats off to you. I've stopped that. I did that for a while. I was burnt out. It's not my ministry anymore right now. I'm just dealing with people who are already here and want to go somewhere else. But I really think at the core, and when I am sometimes in community with people who have different kind of political views. And I really think what it feels like to me is it's really about like healing, right? And TDM, we talk about what does it mean to be in right relationship with ourselves, with one another, with our communities, with our ecosystems. And so I think if we can start talking about the healing, which arts is a foundational part of, I think most humans can connect with that, right? And so it's not really about blaming you, but it's really about understanding the histories so that we can like know how to move forward, but also so we can do like the critical work to heal collectively, right? Because we're all interconnected in this. And so if we can have some sort of like bridge in that space, that can reach some people. But I don't spend a lot of my time doing that because I'm tired of it. And if you don't get it at this point, I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. But I do think people do. I think very few people get the opportunity to heal in these systems, get the opportunity to just rest and think and process, whether you are from like the colonial space, colonized territories, whether you're whatever your race is. Like we're like rats in the race. We're like constantly going, and there's no time to be a human. There's no time to have emotion. There's no time to cry, right? When we're in quote unquote professional spaces. And that's for us. Part of the reason why we start with a somatic session is because we want people to tap into something different than what oftentimes these Zoom meetings allow us to tap into. And then if we're trying to do this work, so much of it is about like emotions, feelings, connections, and we just don't have an outlet oftentimes in terms of how, for many of us who come to this space, we've been like very much invested in like colonial like educational systems and workspaces that produce a certain type of human, and we're trying to break that. And so I think I agree that the emotion is, but I also think like the material conditions are also important because we do live in capitalism. And so I agree that it's more important that if you can to continue to do the work because the healing is so important. And it's not necessarily even just about money, right? But it's about like if we have artists in our spaces? Are there ways that we can support them to be able to meet their material needs so that they can do this work that's so valuable, right? Outside of the traditional, like, okay, they don't call it philanthropy, what's it called? Benefactor or sponsor type model, right? Are there ways the community can support this critical work so that they can do this and can also like eat, right? So that they can, because part of the way I think the system like robs us is that the work that's really important to us, it gets so marginalized that you have to make these like critical decisions when like your healing is critical to you. Being able to survive the system while we're building towards something like more just and liberatory is also critical. So I'm just thinking of like, are there ways that we can also think through how to support this outside of the traditional capitalist benefactor model? I agree with you, and thank you for sharing. Made me emotional too.
Just a comment on that. I think I don't try to have conversation with far right people, but I think it's a bit inevitable when you're from like from a white family like I am, because I think my frustration was with the far right to begin with a lot, but then I realized that the far right is just reacting. They don't know what they're angry at. They are being angry because people are telling them to be angry and them giving something to blame, and that's migrants. So for me now, I think it's I don't have some conversation with the far right, but I try not to agitate them as much, but focus more on I don't know what you can say it, but like neoliberals, fake progressives. I don't know what you say. I think Jamil said it well in the chat that there's a lot, especially I would say in Sweden, that they're trying to kind of moralize themselves, that like in the past socialistic Sweden was very decolonial, when that is not the truth. They were not anti-racist. So I think I'm just trying to, it's just so hard to have the conversation with people that are not aware. And therefore I always react a bit when people blame the far right today, because that will just enlarge the problem. Because the problem, of course, far right is a problem in a way, but they have not been in control, created this. It's the neoliberal who has created and spurred on this problem. Yeah, I know it's very difficult, because for me, coming from Sweden, and as you said as well, like being educated in a colonial system as well, when you go to the workplaces, there's so few people that really understand. I think the first time now when people really do see the patterns is with Palestine, for example. But it's still very tough to have the conversations, because people still see themselves, like I think I would say the majority of people still see themselves as liberators in a way, and no one is aware, or like very few people are aware, that we had a colonial island in Sant Bethlehem, I think it was called. So yeah, it's a big gap in knowledge to point out the system. So yeah.
I mean, I wanna go to the South African condition, right? In terms of Adam. So funny enough, South Africa's got like xenophobia. So because we're a country born out of violence, we kind of have quite an intimacy about violence. And I think our healing hasn't or even started, right? Because there's many, I could go on. So what I struggle with my family is, and I've traveled to Kenya, to Zimbabwe, and they haven't, right? Because it's a luxury to travel to the rest of Africa. It's hard to go for work. You know, I've had an opportunity to have friends, and I've got friends who've become family that are from the rest of Africa. I struggle to have conversations with people understanding that these are colonial borders, that we, as Africa, we're a project of 1885, and hence, and the internalized racism, right? That you are not gonna see what Cape Town is doing in terms of making Cape Town viable for Europeans. They come with the dollars and making it unaffordable for you as locals. You're not gonna go for the white person, but you're gonna go for someone who looks like you, who you might share clear names with, because you've lost language also. And that for me, it goes into the importance of language. Like my name is in Xhosa, but it has the same meaning as in Swahili. And so, but people don't know, because they didn't get educated in their own histories at some point, right? And so that's the sad part for me with the internalized racism, when it starts to show up. And South Africans will use words like, I'm a foreigner, which is like, I mean, who's foreign in Africa that looks like you? So we deal with it from a different kind. And South Africa also thinks it's the America of Africa. And I'm like, Trump doesn't like you guys. And so there's just the what is it? The dissonance. Like Frantz Fanon talks about the dissonance, right? I mean, and so you see it. And so that's just the other pain that for me I go through. And so I fight my family, and they know it. And I'm like, I went to Zimbabwe. I was okay. Like I was taken care of. We eat the same kind of food. Like it's colonial borders, you know? Like calm down.
Yeah.
But I do fight, and it's exhausting. But it is exhausting, because I'm just like, you're not going to do this to white people the way you like them and been taught to like them.
Wow. Yeah, it's fascinating to hear. It's like the same. It's like a similar fight, but very different at the same time. Yeah, it's definitely a fight over here too.
No, and it just reminds me of how much of this has been killed. Like I'm only rediscovering now the logic behind Pan-African movements, no? And as you were just saying, like, we're neighbors. What do you mean? But then there's also like a lot of fear. The same thing happens in Latin America and South America. Like there's this oh my gosh, you're going to Colombia? Like I can't believe you're gonna put yourself at risk, you know, but it's all a bunch of like cartels and stuff. And I spent a month there. And I mean, yeah, of course the same ills that are plaguing there are the ones that are leaving us in these conditions of segregation, right? Like you're saying that housing in Cape is segregated, same in or like people don't have access to them. The same thing happens in Puerto Rico. Like they have a law that allows America, like mainland Americans, which tend to be white, the wealthier Americans, to go to Puerto Rico to buy out the lands after Hurricane Maria. They didn't have any money to repair Puerto Rico, but they certainly had money to support the real estate buyout of Puerto Rico. So the same thing that happened to Hawaii, not to quote Bad Bunny songs, but same thing that happened to Hawaii is being replicated in Puerto Rico. Same thing that is now going to be played as the liberation of Venezuela. And I'm not like minimizing the struggle that Venezuela has gone through, but the same thing now that is being sold as the liberalization of Venezuela is going to be used to start a military operation in South America. So I think looking beyond this white lens, this colonial lens, is so important. And it's true for places in Europe just as much as it is for the rest of the world. I mean, that's why I think also what Hakima, I think, was saying is like, we have to recognize in the disenfranchised far right movement in Europe that the struggles are the same. Like you might be sad now, we might be sad, and I say we, because in the US it's the same story. You might be sad now because all of a sudden you see this accumulation of wealth and I can't even pay my bills, but you've been riding off of the how do you say, the sfruttamento, taking the wealth of, benefiting from, I can't remember the word, but anyway, yeah, the theft of the other places that gave you this cushy life that now you're crying that you can't afford anymore, no?
Mm. Yeah, it's happening like on a very small level here in Sweden as well. Like we have a very far right government in power at the moment, and they're shifting the blame not only on migrants, but like they're putting the blames on criminality, and they're putting all the blames on people who are not white Swedes. So they're pinpointing actual areas within the country of Sweden, and if you look at the countries that they try to pinpoint, or sorry, the areas where they try to pinpoint, that's a municipality or it's a county with a very diverse and multicultural base. So same thing is happening even in like just Sweden, which is horrible to see.
I wanted to respond to that quickly. It's a point that I made in an earlier thread about, particularly in relation to what happened in Europe, um, is the reconstruction that whiteness has undergone over the last 100 years, right? Because we come out of so now first is to recognize that there is in fact this is a form of identity that undergoes reconstruction. It is not stable as it tries to it's not as the impression it tries to create of being stable. But so we come out of a period where slavery had then recently across the world been abolished, right? And up until that point, it was quite a prestigious thing, in many ways still, but prestigious thing to be white. It was not, it was not, um, it wasn't disagreeable that you had committed crimes against humanity. In fact, it was some form of an obligation to your society that you were participating in. Um, you are proud. You are proud to be somebody who abuses other people's human rights. And if you are not directly participating, you are happy to benefit from those violent actions of others. Because a couple of countries in Europe who claim, but we didn't do those things. We were not implicated. We were not didn't directly have a hand in it. And yet your economy is benefited, right? And so all these various configurations. And so over a period of time, and then comes the Second World War, and then comes a genocide of Jewish people who post that genocide then get admitted into whiteness, right? So here's a form of reconstruction. So this admission of formerly non-white people into the category of whiteness now requires all other categories of whiteness to be redefined and to have their identities redefined. And so from there, we move into this human rights sort of discourse and the message of never again. And we believe in the protection of human life and all of this. But out of that entire period comes a predominantly white Europe with amassed resources that the world now supposedly looks to for help, right? And so now you become the savior with the resources that you plundered from the people that now rely on you for help. And you become, the daddy warbucks of the world. And you are the reason now why other people get a chance to live. And over time, that narrative has then, that sort of philanthropic narrative has morphed into we're being taken advantage of. We're being taken advantage of, and these people just take. This is a narrative that now exists amongst ordinary people when the elites know that it is a part of the design of the system that, quote unquote, those people will always look to us for help because they're never supposed to get out of that cycle, right? But what that then now also people are starting to migrate and diversity is being brought into areas. So now people can see the physical evidence of this taking advantage of, right? Because the other is now in front of me in my space. And where we then come to, which has in the last 20, 30, let's say 30 years, is this narrative of besiegement. White people are under threat. their things are being taken away from them. And this also coincides with more calls for reparations, more calls for accountability, more calls for decolonization. Is we are under threat. And where we are now, so to your point, Adam, with one form of that being this shift to a far-right narrative built on the fallacy of immigration in Sweden, but in other places, it's similar but looks different, is where we are now is that white people are under threat, and if they don't stand up and fight back against this threat, they are going to be wiped out. And so it is their job now to participate in wiping out the other before they are taken out, right? And so there's definitely not just a social and economic element to that narrative, because of course whiteness understands itself very much in economic terms, in its access and execution of economic power, right? Which is what this entire industrial complex is about. So there's definitely been, over the last 100 years, a lot that has gone into the reconstruction of whiteness and how it understands itself, that leads us to the struggle that you are sitting with now, where you are asking, where did my family go so wrong? And it definitely has to be a part of the conversation, because that system of domination is so implicated in all of the things that we are talking about. It's just inescapable.
Well said.
Isn't there I think you have a professor, you reminded me of Akil Membe. He's Cameroonian. I think he's actually in University of Joburg, maybe. But it reminded me of what you were saying about how now, like, we have this politics that pretends to talk about human rights, and it's, this post-Holocaust narrative that emerged from a space that didn't even recognize the genocides that came before that. And Akil Membe. And but actually, what we're living are necropolitics, like who actually has the right to a decent life. And then I was reading this other book, Perfect Victims, where the need to humanize, as if to justify your right to life, is what the Palestinian experience is currently. And yeah, this process, it's degrading for all sides, right? It's almost like this toxic thing that's happening that makes you also want to critique the concept of race in itself, because the notion of whiteness as being like, oh no, they're taking from us, but then no one's winning in this. It's a zero-sum game.
I do also want to add how I think the concept of whiteness definitely needs its own study, and I don't want to take away from that, but how whiteness also expands to like the conceptualizations of whiteness to potentially include us all, right? When we talk about the seduction of empire. And so you have people who buy into like, what is it called? Like Black capitalists in the US context, right? Who think that if you show up a certain way, if you speak a certain way, if you go to a certain kind of college, if you lust after money in a certain type of way, you too will gain entry, right? And I think in the US context, so that's where I'm based right now, like when you look at, there's this pipeline, it's also happening in the UK. I think the head of the Conservative Party, we've talked about this, is a Nigerian woman, Adanma. Shout out to your people. Just messing with you. But like, sometimes where we come from, we have these conservative values. We come from spaces where we hold a lot of power and we don't engage with that. So when we come to spaces of whiteness, we want to align with who the power players are, and it's whiteness. And so you kind of craft an identity to pull you closer and closer to that center of power. And so like that seduction is so real across the world, whether or not like you could be my complexion or darker and still like trying to get into the fold of whiteness, right? It's this lifelong desire. And so what like the trajectory that Jamil talked about Jewish people being like engulfed into whiteness, and now you were once a victim, now can become the perpetrator. For me, when I look at that, I think of like, that's a potential pathway for me, right? Because if you can be victimized to that extent and then can turn around and be, such an oppressor, wow, we all have to like be very mindful and vigilant against that, because the lust for that and like the backing of empire to be able to do that is so strong. And so for me, yeah, that's also something that I'm very mindful as well of, like, yeah, it can, I don't appear white, but it can definitely trap me as well. Yeah, that's my intervention. But we are getting to, I know we're past the half hour. We have these, as we said, we have these conversations every Wednesday. If you're interested in joining the network or just continue to join us in D20, I put the link in. If you are interested, I'll put it in again. And if anyone has any closing statements, I don't want to cut off if the conversation is still going, but I do also want to be mindful of everyone's time. We're really appreciative of y'all spending almost 3 hours with us today. Thank you so much. So yeah, we'll allow for any closing remarks and then we can close out, and yeah, you continue with your day. Wonderful. So we hope you'll join us tomorrow.
Thank you guys for the space.
Oh, thank you for joining, and thank you for all that you sharing all your brilliance with us. We really appreciate it. I'm really happy to be in community with you and everyone else on this call. All right. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining, and take good care. And hopefully we'll see you again throughout D20 week.